talking today all about conditioning reinforcers. I'm Carrie Sousa Woodward. I'm a board-certified behavior analyst, and I've been working with autistic children and their families for 22 years now. Reinforcers are these things in our life that strengthen our behavior. They're the things that when they happen to us after we engage in a specific behavior, that behavior is strengthened. They are what powers our world of behavior. They're super important and they're very relevant to autistic people and why autistic people have deficits in social interaction. The fact that autistic people are less social or struggle with social skills is sort of a core feature of autism. And it stems largely from the fact that from infancy, autistic babies look a lot less often at people, they watch people less frequently, and they're less reinforced by social things like people, looking at people's faces, seeing smiles, hearing social praise. These things function less as reinforcement for autistic people than they do for neurotypical people. And we still don't really know why this is the case, whether or not it's that they're born less motivated to look at people, and so therefore they're not picking up on all of the social behaviors that they need to learn, or if there is something inherent in autism that creates this barrier to watching people and learning by watching and looking at people. Okay, so reinforcement. When we engage in a specific behavior, if reinforcement follows that behavior, meaning that something that functions as a reinforcer for us follows that behavior is strengthened over time. It becomes a stronger behavior. We do it more often. And reinforcement's at work all day, every day, not just for autistic people, but it's how every human being's behavior sort of becomes shaped and changed over time. And what functions as a reinforcer for me does not necessarily function as a reinforcer for anybody else, because reinforcers are based on our current levels of satiation and deprivation. So if I'm hungry, then food will serve as a reinforcer for me in that moment. But if I just finished a meal, food is not going to serve as a reinforcer for me because I'm full and I don't want to have any more food. But reinforcers and how they vary from person to person goes beyond just our current level of satiation and deprivation. It also goes to what our history is with things. You see, this is so cool. Humans are born into this world with just a handful of things that serve to reinforce us. We call these primary reinforcers because we needed no prior conditioning. We needed no learning with these items. And here's the list. Food when hungry, drinks when thirsty, freedom from pain, removal from cold or excessive heat. These are things that are innate to us as humans when we're born. We don't need any history with these things for them to serve as reinforcement. But everything else in our life that serves to reinforce us has undergone some sort of reinforcer conditioning process. This just means that it was at one time not a reinforcer, and it was paired with something that was an established reinforcer to become a reinforcer for us. Everything other than the primary reinforcers have undergone this reinforcer conditioning in order to become reinforcers for us. So let's take an example of an infant that's just been born and is nursing at her mother's chest. So nursing or eating is a primary reinforcer. If you're hungry and food is there, that food is already an established reinforcer for us. But think about the things that become paired with this nursing activity. We're holding a baby, we're looking down at the baby, maybe we're smiling, we're talking. So all of a sudden now, warm touch, comfort, your mother's voice, your mother's face and smile all become conditioned reinforcers because they are being paired simultaneously with this primary reinforcer of eating. And how reinforcer conditioning works is that over time, as this pairing happens numerous times, these things start to become their own reinforcers without needing to be paired along with the nursing anymore. So hearing mother's voice is a reinforcer. Seeing mother's smile is a reinforcer. Seeing her face is a reinforcer. But if we think about autistic babies, where the research is showing us that from infancy, they are not looking at people's faces and at people as often as neurotypical babies, we have this nursing that happens. It's a primary reinforcer. It's going to be a reinforcer for an autistic baby also. But think about maybe the baby is not looking at her mother's face. Maybe she's looking out the window and seeing the leaves blowing on the trees. The leaves blowing on the trees is what's getting the benefit of this pairing, and that's what's going to become more conditioned reinforcer as opposed to mother's face, mother's voice, mother's smile. And as babies grow, obviously their pool of reinforcers becomes larger because there are more and more things being paired and associated with already established reinforcers. So now we think about that infant who's trying to learn how to crawl, which is a sort of instinctual behavior. But there is also an element of looking and observing, watching other people. So your baby gets up on their knees and on their hands in sort of a crawl position. And if you're familiar with infants, you know that one of the first things that they begin to do is sort of rock back and forth in this motion. And it's like gathering momentum, right? And so as a mother, you're watching your infant kind of assume this position and you're doing things like, yay, oh, yay, that's so cool. You're smiling, you're cheering, your voice. If your baby is sensitive to these things as reinforcers, then these are going to start to strengthen the behavior that your baby's engaging in. This is what's going to sort of start shaping the crawling because your baby is being reinforced for doing all of this. Now, if your baby is an autistic baby, and they have not had the benefit of the reinforcer conditioning for these social things, then these social things do not serve to reinforce. So as our autistic babies engage in behavior and we provide social consequences that would otherwise function as reinforcement for most babies, our autistic baby might not actually be reinforced because these things may be neutral, meaning they have no reinforcing effect on behavior. So not only does the research show us that at a very early age, autistic babies are not looking at people as often, there's also research that shows us that autistic people are less reinforced by social stimuli. And when we talk about social stimuli, these are just social things in our environment. It may just be a person's face. It may be social interaction. It may be social consequences that you're used to seeing in classrooms, like, good job, wow, awesome, thumbs up, smiles, wow, keep it up. These are all social stimuli, and they do serve as reinforcement for a large population of people. But they are less effective reinforcers, if they are reinforcers at all, for most autistic people. Which means that if you don't know this, you walk around with your autistic children and you're providing these social consequences thinking that they're going to strengthen behavior, and they're not because they're neutral at best. So understanding that autistic people look less often at people, and knowing that autistic people are less sensitive to social stimuli as reinforcers, you can see how these two things go hand in hand because all social reinforcers are conditioned. We are not born with any sort of primary reinforcer that is social in nature. They become established over time with this pairing. And so if our autistic babies are not attending to social stimuli like people's faces, like smiles, like listening or attending to social praise or words, then those things are not gaining the benefit of this pairing procedure to become reinforcers. And so this also sort of has a double impact on learning, because if autistic children are not looking at people enough, they're not capturing all of the learning opportunities that people present. Most social behavior is behavior that we watch and we learn through imitation. So if your child isn't looking and watching people, they're missing out on all these learning. Now, let's say they happen to glance up and see something important and they want to try it out themselves, and you provide a social consequence hoping it's reinforcement to strengthen that behavior, but it doesn't serve as reinforcement. And so not only is learning lower because they're not picking up on learning opportunities, even when they do pick up on learning opportunities, we may be providing social consequences that do not serve as reinforcement. And what we know about behavior is that behavior has to be reinforced in order for it to continue happening, in order for it to strengthen over time. If it is not reinforced, this is what we call extinction, and that means that the behavior is eventually going to stop happening. So if your child did pick up on the learning and then you didn't reinforce it because you provided a social consequence, then we can see how learning is even doubly impacted. It's happening less often because there are fewer opportunities, and it's being reinforced less because parents don't understand that their social consequences are not functioning as reinforcers for their children. In my work with autistic children and their families, my job was to identify skills that were missing from the child's repertoire and that they needed in order to be successful, and then develop teaching programs in order to give them these skills. And what's a critical component to a teaching program is identifying things that function as reinforcers and providing those reinforcers every single time the child engages in the desired behavior, because we want that desired behavior to happen more often. And in doing this, we often incorporated what we called arbitrary reinforcers. And they're called arbitrary because they simply are not associated at all with the task at hand. So let's say we're trying to work on teaching toothbrushing, and we are utilizing toy reinforcers. It has nothing to do with the toothbrushing activity. They're arbitrary. But because reinforcement is necessary for behavior to increase or improve, we needed to use things that functioned as reinforcers, not things we hoped were a reinforcer, but things that we knew functioned as reinforcers in order to be able to strengthen these skills that were necessary for children. And I can tell you that a lot of parents pushed back initially because they're like, my other kids don't need to be given a sticker or a toy after doing everything I asked them to do. And that's right, because most neurotypical children are sensitive to social reinforcement, which means that you could simply be like, great job, wow, nice job with your toothbrushing. And that was enough to strengthen the toothbrushing behavior for your neurotypical child. But because autistic children are not as sensitive to social reinforcement, we can't rely on putting out social consequences and just hoping that they serve to reinforce the behavior. Because then essentially our child's behavior is wasted. The learning is wasted. We've done all of this work to try to teach this child a skill, and what we've done is provide neutral consequences that are not going to strengthen that behavior moving forward. So we had to bring in some of these arbitrary reinforcers, at least in the beginning. So understanding how other reinforcers become reinforcers is understanding this sort of reinforcer conditioning process, right? The whole pairing of an established reinforcer with something that's neutral over time begins to provide reinforcing qualities to this previously neutral thing. That's how all of the reinforcers are sort of conditioned throughout our life, other than the very small number of primary reinforcers. Knowing this, we can actually intentionally do this pairing procedure in order to establish more natural reinforcers for our kids so that we don't have to rely on giving a toy every single time that they do something. And in a perfect world, what we're doing is we are working on these reinforcer conditioning procedures to pair social consequences with established reinforcers because we want social consequences to become reinforcers for our kids. Why? Because that's what's happening in the natural environment. If we want our children to learn in the natural environment, there are two things that need to happen. One, learning opportunities need to be there, meaning we need to get our kids geared into looking at people more often so that they're available for the learning that's happening there. And two, we need social consequences to function as reinforcement for them so that when they're in their classroom and the teacher asks a question and your child raises their hand and answers the question and the teacher says, yes, you're right, great job. That needs to serve as reinforcement. And if it doesn't yet, we need to do the work in order to do this reinforcer conditioning to make those things function as reinforcement for your child. But it's tricky because what needs to happen is that when the actual reinforcer is being presented to your child, it needs to be paired with this thing we hope to become a reinforcer, which means that your child actually has to be attending to, watching, seeing, hearing all of the things we want to be a reinforcer while they are engaging in the other reinforcing thing. And if our kids are not naturally geared to look up at your face and see your face as you're giving them something, we're missing out on this pairing opportunity. We could say, great job, 1,000 times, but if your child isn't attending to your voice, if they're attending to, the lawnmower outside or the sound of the fan clicking, that's what's being paired, not the words that you're using. So the reinforcer conditioning with social stimuli is very, very difficult, and that's why most practitioners don't do it. What they end up doing is conditioning things like tokens. Tokens are these sort of neutral things, maybe a sticker. They may be using a laminated Velcro board where they're handing your child a token to put onto the board. And when they get 10 tokens, they can exchange that board for a reinforcing activity, like going and playing on the iPad or coloring or doing something that we know serves to reinforce their kids. And why? Why does a practitioner want to condition these tokens to serve as reinforcement? Well, we know that we have to provide something that does reinforce a child following the behavior that we want to see more of or that we're working on teaching. And in an ABA program, we're doing hundreds of learning opportunities, which means that if you have to provide a toy every single time that the child engages in the desired behavior, we also need to remember that we need to give them enough time with that toy for it to be reinforcing, okay? So if the iPad is a reinforcer for me, and I've been asked to do something and I do it and I get the iPad, but I only get it for 5 seconds, long enough for me to hit the home button and have it open up and then have it be taken away from me, that is not a reinforcer. Having it long enough for it to serve as a reinforcer, it's going to take time, which means that takes time out of learning, because the longer that the child is sitting watching the iPad is the less time that you actually have to devote to learning. So practitioners like to condition tokens because you can hand over a token very quickly. You hand it over, they put it on, you do the next learning opportunity. You hand it over, you put it on, do the next learning opportunity. But most practitioners are conditioning tokens inefficiently and ineffectively, which means that these tokens might also sort of just be neutral until you get to the very end, and that last token that happens right before the child's allowed to access the backup reinforcer or the iPad or whatever they're working for, that last token may serve to reinforce because it's happening in such close temporal proximity to accessing the reinforcer, but all the tokens that led up to it, if they have not been conditioned properly, are most likely neutral and not actually functioning as a reinforcer. And tokens are not my favorite, but they are practical. Why aren't they my favorite? Because they're very ungeneralizable. If your child is in a different community setting or in a classroom environment and they're not with the people that have worked closely with them that understand the tokens, then they're most likely not going to be using tokens. Your child might be doing all of these things that are going unreinforced because what we've done is we've worked to condition tokens as reinforcers and not done the work to try to condition natural social consequences as reinforcers. But sometimes it's necessary, and sometimes it's necessary for an interim period while you're working on establishing social stimuli as reinforcement. So let's talk about how to condition tokens so that if you're going to be doing tokens, you're doing it in the right way. The biggest mistake I see with token economies is that somebody just sits down with a token board of 10 tokens and immediately takes off the 10 tokens and has the child start working. They have zero history of being paired with already established reinforcers, so they're probably neutral, and then our child's having to work a lot and not getting reinforced until they get access to the backup reinforcer. So what has to happen is that you start with your token board and you decide how many tokens you want to work on and start that from the beginning because you don't want to manipulate the board. The board is going to come to acquire reinforcing effects if the conditioning is done correctly. So create your token board in whatever way you're going to do it. And if it's going to be 10 tokens, start with 10. But as you begin to work, don't take off all 10. Take off just the last one. So your child sees this board with 9 tokens already on it. You ask them to do something, you give them that last token, they finish the board. Seeing the completed board is they have to turn it into you in order to get the reinforcer, okay? So this handover and receiving is actually really important because we want the whole 10 tokens to see that and have that already sort of be a conditioned reinforcer. That when I see the full board, I know that's when I'm done and I can move it over. And you're gonna do this for a while. You're gonna just have one token, and this is a one-to-one pairing. You ask them to do something, they do it, they get that last token, they put the token on their board, they see the completed board, they hand it over to you, then they get the backup reinforcer. Then you're going to take 2 tokens off and you're going to have them do 1 and 2 before handing it back over. If we have done the pairing for long enough, then the tokens are going to acquire their own reinforcing qualities so that when your child receives the token, that response is essentially reinforced. And you're going to gradually build up. So you do 2 tokens, then you do 3, then you're going to work backward until you have the full empty board. Your child sits down. They're able to work with you to receive the 10 tokens. They finish that token board, they hand it over, and then they get access to whatever the backup reinforcement is. Again, tokens not my favorite, but sometimes they're a necessary evil in order to make learning happen in a very efficient way while you're working to condition social reinforcers, because the social reinforcement is really where your biggest bang for the buck is. Social reinforcement, social consequences are happening everywhere, and it's part of our social community. If we can get our children to be sensitive to these social reinforcers, their ability to learn in the natural environment is going to skyrocket. So how do we condition social stimuli to function as reinforcers for our kids? So what I talked about earlier was that in order for this pairing to happen, in order for the conditioning to happen, 2 stimuli need to be happening simultaneously during this pairing. And a stimulus is only really relevant if it's being attended to. There are millions of stimuli in our environment that we fail to attend to. We didn't notice it, we didn't see it, it was right there, and I didn't even happen to notice that it was there. So just because it's there simultaneously does not necessarily mean that it's being attended to. So the best way that we can make sure that social consequences are being attended to by our children is by doing this procedure where we hang on to a reinforcer until our child's eyes find our face. And then we guarantee that their eyes have landed on our face. They're attending to our face. Our face is now being paired with this established reinforcer. And so here's how it looks. You ask your child something. And I always start by doing things that are very easy for our kid and that are mastered skills, because we don't want to mess around with things that are difficult for our child or that they're just learning how to do, because we are going to be withholding the actual reinforcer until they find our face. So that means that finding our face is going to be the reinforced behavior and not necessarily the behavior that they're engaging in before that. So let me give you an example. If I were to ask the child, hey, when's your birthday? And they say January 3rd, and I hold on to the reinforcer until the eyes find my face, and then I provide the reinforcer. What we know is that the behavior that immediately precedes reinforcement is what's going to be reinforced. So saying January 3rd might actually not be reinforced. What will be reinforced is finding my face, which is great because we want kids to be looking at faces a lot more because that's where learning is happening. So we're getting twofold benefit here, is that we are actually working to strengthen the behavior of putting eyes on a face, and we are pairing the face, making sure that our child sees our face, with the delivery of this established reinforcer, so that faces begin to become more valuable to our child, that we're building reinforcement into a face. And then we're going to start pairing some of these social phrases that serve as reinforcement in the natural environment. We're going to pair social praise. We're going to say, awesome, as their eyes land on our face and we hand over the reinforcer. Hey, where do you live? I live in California. Wow! And smile. All of these things being paired together as we deliver the reinforcer once their eyes find our face. So that some of these social phrases that serve to reinforce kids in a classroom setting are going to become established reinforcers for your child. And we're going to do that thinning procedure the same way that we would do with the tokens, meaning every single time that you ask your child to do something and they find your face and you give the reinforcer, then it's going to be every other time that you give the reinforcer. So you would say, hey, when's your birthday? January 3rd. Wow, cool. But you're not going to give the reinforcer. You're going to ask an immediate follow-up question. Hey, where do you live? California. Wow. Finding the face, handing over the reinforcer. And you do this and gradually thin out how many times you deliver social consequences before providing that actual backup reinforcer. We measure whether or not something functions as a reinforcer based on its effect on behavior. So we actually deliver something and we see, does that behavior improve, increase, or get strengthened over time? And if it does, we know we've got a reinforcer on our hands. And if the behavior does not, then we know that it's not a reinforcer. So we do all of this reinforcer conditioning. We do all of this pairing, right? We have to actually test out whether these things are becoming reinforcers through our conditioning process before relying on them very heavily without other backup reinforcers. So we have to start thinking about teaching a new skill using just social consequences as the intended reinforcer to see whether or not it is actually a reinforcer. So pick a new behavior. I used to test out whether these conditioned reinforcers, teaching like a very simple question answer thing, maybe like the capital of a state that the child wouldn't know. And no, it's not very relevant information. Maybe it's not even functional for the child, but what it does is it gives you a very easy way to test whether or not you're dealing with a reinforcer. So you would say, hey, what's the capital of Massachusetts? Boston. So you would teach it, and as the consequence, you would just be using social praise. Wow, that's so cool. Awesome job. Nice. Smiles, trying to make sure that their eyes are landing on our face. And if you can teach this skill, if you can teach your child to answer the question using just these social consequences, then you know that you've effectively conditioned these consequences to be reinforcers for your kids. So if you have a child that is not sensitive to social consequences and is not spending enough time with their eyes on people in order to learn more naturally, these are the two things that you can do in order to condition social consequences to function as reinforcement. And through that process, we're actually strengthening and reinforcing the behavior of putting eyes on faces. So it's twofold, and it cues your child in to their social environment a lot more. And then what it does is it gives them these beautiful skills that they can take into other environments with other people that may not know their history with tokens or may not have the token board, or we forgot to pack the token board in the backpack. Forget it. We didn't need it, because what we have done is we have worked to make these natural social consequences function as reinforcement for our kids. They're paying attention to people more. They're watching around and looking at people, which is where learning happens. They're imitating and trying out what they're seeing, and then they're sensitive to the social consequences that are happening as reinforcement, and so these behaviors then get strengthened. So this is the reinforcer conditioning process. It's why it's so hugely important, and it's something that I think a lot of practitioners are even missing from their children's programs. If your child is already in an ABA program and you haven't seen them working to establish these social consequences as reinforcers, please make that request to the BCBA managing your program. We want these natural consequences to strengthen behavior so that we don't need to rely on giving an M&M after every response, giving a toy to play with after every response. It's how natural learning happens for most children. And so we want to give our kids these tools so that they can access learning in the environment the way that neurotypical kids do. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already so that you can be sure to know exactly when the next video is happening. I hope that you found benefit in this video. I hope that you learned a lot and that you can start putting some of these techniques into practice with your own child.